Thanks for joining us for another episode of Biotech and Life Sciences CEOs. Our guest today is Dr. Amy Baxter, CEO of Pain Care Labs, a company dedicated to using their patented neuromodulation mechanical stimulation platform to alleviate fear and pain associated with needles, particularly for children, as well as reducing muscular skeletal pain in adults. Amy is a graduate of Yale and Emory University Medical School. And prior to founding Pain Care Labs, she worked in pediatrics, I think, in the ER. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
You are so welcome. Yes, peds emergency and procedural sedation and child abuse and clinical research and all of those things.
Yeah, how did you go from pediatrics to an interest in pain?
Well, I was always interested in suffering. I think a lot of doctors go in to alleviate suffering, and a lot of doctors go in to figure things out, and they're not necessarily overlapping. Mostly they are, but as a kid, I was sitting on the corner with mercurochrome. Do you remember that, Tim?
Sure.
Red bottle of
Yeah.
antiseptic stuff that makes you look bloodier than you were before you scraped your knee, and a band-aid. And I was just, hoping somebody got hurt so I could be the one who's like, I'll save you.
Yeah.
That was the interest. So pain was always part of what I liked about emergency medicine. I want to fix you. And for me, what I want to fix is you feeling bad. I'm not, was never as interested, or perhaps too ADHD to have patience for the really long drawn out stuff. It was much more I want to pop your nursemaid's elbow back in. I want to sew up that gash. I want to get in there and have you go home dramatically improved from the way you came in. Okay. So that was really, whether it was pain or nausea or diagnosing child abuse, all of those things were really the quick win, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what was the transition like from practicing medicine to founding a business? Because taking care of people versus building a business.
Yeah. It was accidental. I had just moved from UT Southwestern, and I had created and figured out the vibration frequency that would block pain and made Buzzy for my kids, but I wasn't really going to do anything. I offered it to UT Southwestern to commercialize, and they were like, thanks, but no thanks. If you sell it, give us 25% within a year. Sell it within a year, give us 25%. And so they weren't interested and didn't see a commercial use for it. So I didn't bother. I moved to a non-academic environment when I moved to Atlanta because there was a database on procedural sedation that the private practice group, Scottish Rite, had. They were part of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, but not officially, no academic titles. And so I was like, well, I'm going to take the leap. I really want to do this research. So I'm just going to get off the academic treadmill. Once I was there and I did the research in procedural sedation, I really became convinced that there is a spectrum of pain management at which you need to not be cognizant. You need to be knocked out. But there's a lot of places where blocking pain is cognitive, and where having something specific to block the pain, like a vibrating device, is really important for minor pain, like needle pain. So all of that said, since I had something that would block pain and I couldn't use it in the emergency room because it was stuck together with duct tape, I decided to do some research, got a grant from the Mayday Fund, and then talked to a family friend who said, what you really need to do is you need to start a company, because you're not in academia. You can't get a normal R01 anymore, the regular NIH funding mechanism that this would have been appropriate for. But you can start a company, and then 3% of the NIH funds and CDC and NSR go to entrepreneurs. So start a company, then you can go. So I never quit practicing. I got a leave of absence from the sedation group, because you have to be 51% employed by your small business. So I got a sabbatical, I got a reduction in clinical hours, and figured, how long can it take? I'll knock this off and be good to go. That was 2006. 2009 is when I got the grant. 9 is also when we launched a version of Buzzy, and 2014 is when we got our 510K clearances. 2000 maybe 12 is when I realized that we had a huge increase in needle fear, and I was like, uh-oh, we're going to have, if we have a pandemic, we're going to have 28% of people who won't get vaccinated. So I tried to raise awareness of that while still practicing for a while. I got so frustrated because people were like, oh yeah, but you're selling a device. So the stench of commercialism and entrepreneurship clings too closely to you. I'm not going to believe that there's an issue with needle fear. So I was kind of ready to chunk it in when one of my colleagues used the Buzzy device to not take opioids after surgery.
Right.
And so I didn't decide to quit practicing until then, and that was 2016. So most of the business starting was me raising 3 children and directing our research division and practicing emergency medicine and running the company out of my basement and being fried to a bloody crisp.
So when you filed the patents for Buzzy, UT Southwestern didn't come back and say, hey, wait a minute.
Oh, well, no, they actually did at one point. However, by then I'd started a company. And so I sold the idea and the patents to the company for $1. So I offered to send UT Southwestern a quarter, and I never heard back.
Okay. And they didn't of course say, we know now, that really was a subterfuge, and that's not the value of the patent.
I mean, do we know now? Thus far, we have not. We've got one angel investor, and I think the thing is that what I've learned now about pain management is actually doesn't have that much to do with what we started with. What I started with, I really thought it was the ice that was doing it, like something called descending inhibition and cold spray. And I also thought there was a lot of distraction for kids that was part of it. And so the most recent patents we have are much more sophisticated in terms of frequencies and other aspects of this. But the other thing was they gave me a 1 year. I mean, that this was probably on them, but they gave me a 1 year, if you sell it within a year, then we want this. And so I didn't really do anything with it
For a year.
and didn't refine it, and didn't actually, I mean, at the time I had it was a little vibrator on a stick that had, I kid you not, googly eyes and the springs from pins with a little bit of clay on the end to make antenna. So perhaps that also led to its being underestimated as the next big thing in external neuromodulation.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing like googly eyes to undermine your legitimacy.
Right. So let's talk about needles for a second, because you mentioned 28% might not take the vaccine. Before we got on, I was talking about how that was part of why I started this podcast. And our ability to vaccinate against disease has increased exponentially since I was a kid. I'm much older than you, the mumps and measles and chicken pox. I had all of those things. I spent a month of the summer in bed with the mumps. It was horrible. And a little TV about this big. But now, of course, we vaccinate for all those things. And has that had any impact on fear of needles?
Yeah. So what and I really want to talk about the opioid crisis and pain.
We're going to get there.
But all right. Just, and funding and our medical reimbursement system. But the short thing is that we started giving boosters in 1985, 82, 85. And so anyone born before then got all of your childhood vaccines before you were 2 years old, and you don't remember. You got 6 shots. And maybe you got a shot for strep, or maybe you got a shot for something else, but you don't have the kind of needle fear that a kid who had a bad experience with those boosters had. Because between age 4 and 6, you cannot abstract, but you can remember. And so as an adult, you can't logic yourself out of a fear you didn't come to logically. So what you've got is this residual memory of a very disturbing event when the people who are supposed to keep you safe are repeatedly jabbing you, and that leaves a mark. So that is why adults who are afraid of needles tend to have been born in 82 or later, because they were old enough to get those 4 to 6 year vaccines. Boom, 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 and it's those experiences that cause it. If you only got one shot at a time, we found in our Buzzy study, I realized how much needle fear had increased, and I was like, wow, I must have messed up. Then somebody in Toronto, Anna Taddeo, published almost the exact same number of adolescents with needle fear. And so I was like, this is a bellwether. This is not an error. And so got a new IRB, went back, looked at the data again, and that was where we saw a dose response to between age 4 and 6. If you came back once or twice to get those boosters, then you weren't afraid of needles. If you got 3 on one day, only a quarter of those people were afraid. But if you got 4 or 5 shots on the same day, 64% of them were severely afraid of needles 5 years later. So yeah, there you go.
We've just overcome that with Oliver, in fact, because he didn't have any of his vaccinations when he came to live with me. I held him down for 6 shots. And the nurses were so good. I mean, it happened in 20 seconds. But ever since, he's been afraid of needles until this past couple of weeks when he had to have blood drawn. And he was a trooper. And then he had it drawn again, and he was fine. It cost me a few Robux, but it's been okay.
Yeah.
But so, okay, you develop Buzzy for children and needles.
Mm-hmm.
And then your colleague, who I guess had a prior opiate experience.
Successful recovery, 20 years. Yeah.
And that caused you, I think, to develop VitaCool, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also to decide to try to get another SBIR and really lean into the science. My best friend in high school died my first or second year of college from a heroin overdose. And I was just furious. Sue, what an idiot. How did you get into this? And all along the path of the guy she was dating and such, I had been really dubious and was like, I can't believe you're doing this. But then she died. And so that anger had persisted to also manifest as a misunderstanding of substance use disorder. And the more I started learning, and then I started meeting people who were in recovery and like, well, they're perfectly smart and cool people. What's going on here? And then one of my colleagues, who was a nurse I worked with, they became dependent after a surgery. And then I learned about a woman in Atlanta whose son, Christopher Wolf, he became dependent after a surgery, and he overdosed and died at age 32. So I started becoming more aware that perhaps what I thought was going on with opioid use disorder was not correct. And out of contrition and a desire to really make a difference, and then by then I've got my now 21-year-old, but one of her high school friends was popping pills from a medicine cabinet, and they were afraid that he was going to go into withdrawal when he went away to summer camp because his parents were sending him away, and they were up at 4 a.m, and I was assuming somebody was pregnant, but it was more they were afraid he was going to die. So those experiences led me to realize that this is something that is not what I thought, and it's worthy of untangling and trying to figure out how general pain relief can contribute for more than just one person to being able to not fall into that hole.
So how did you begin that process of untangling?
Yeah, well, first, I had been kind of obnoxious and judgy about any woman who quit practicing medicine, especially right after getting trained, because you owe a debt to society. You have taken a spot from someone and you need to pay it back by practicing. So then I'm like, okay, kids, you know what I've said my whole life about how you need to, if you need to take what you're given and you need to use that, and you owe a debt to society. And I'm thinking about quitting. And so they were like, my daughter in particular said, there are 50,000 people taking their shots with Buzzy every night. Your karmic book is balanced. She was so young that I've got to believe she heard that phrase someplace else and she doesn't remember it. But it was, and my son, who ended up being a philosopher and ethics major, actually she's an ethics minor, he also was like, no, this is a legitimate path. This is not inconsistent with your values. So how did I start untangling it? There was a moment of, for those in your listenership who are old enough to remember The Usual Suspects, where it was kind of like all this stuff all of a sudden came together. And there was a book by an Italian guy named Raul Sagini about vibration in medicine. And it was exhaustively like 300 references in the section on how gate control works, which is the touch nerves that overcome pain, how, what the frequencies are, and all of this stuff. All of a sudden it was like, this is why Buzzy works when the batteries are fresh. This is why it doesn't work with this kind of motor. This is why it doesn't work with this kind of amplitude. This is why, it's just all of these things together. All of a sudden I really understood what the mechanism was of what I was doing. And then once I understood it, then I started to hypothesize on, okay, well then if we did it in this way, it ought to be even more impactful. If we add this part to it, it should be even more useful. And subsequent to that, there was a lot of information about how the brain processes pain, which has changed the way we think about really what the goal is. So the three things the Sackler Purdue medicine taught us in the 90s was that home opioids weren't addictive, and that pain-free is the goal and pills are the path to pain relief. None of those are true. We know that home opioids are addictive, but we still are striving for pain-free, and we still think that if we only had the right pill. And the reality is that the brain is just one giant memory sponge for danger. And so any pain is heavily associated with memory, with meaning, with identity, with options. It's very situational, because that's the purpose of pain, is to keep you safe later on. So with that understanding, of course, a pill is not going to get rid of it for anything long term. It turns out opioids will work for about 3 days, and then you start getting tolerant. And also the vibration thing, which was initially introduced as gate control in 65 by Melzek and Wall, and that's what led to the whole implanted stimulator industry. Okay. Which has recently been proven by a Cochrane review to be no better than placebo. The reason that electricity doesn't actually decrease pain much is because it's the wrong frequency for the way the body works. If you bump your elbow and rub it, there's a very specific frequency that the nerve that's feeling that rubbing transmits, it triggers it to transmit to the spine to block pain. So electricity is too slow. It gives you a light touch kind of tingle, but it doesn't really block big pain. And it also is only part of the story, because anything that gets to the spine and gets to the brain is just a small part, because context and previous experience and all this also matter. Sorry, that's a lot of information.
Is pain connected to pleasure? In other words, so I'm thinking here about the opioid users who are not users because they had a surgery. They're addicted to the pleasure of the drug. Do the nerves work the same way?
Well, it's the areas of the brain that receive pain information. So pain causes receptors in these areas to go off, overlap a lot with areas of pleasure. And by pleasure, it's really reward, it's more, we call it rewards, but it's dopamine, it's serotonin, it's oxytocin. And so which makes sense. I mean, push me, pull you. You've got, if you're looking at this as a safety model, then you want to have things that you go toward and there are things that you go away from. So what opioids do is they activate the dopamine specifically reward center. So you're still feeling pain, you just don't care because it feels good enough. About 6, and I don't know, I can send you the graphic that I made, but about 6.5% of people who misuse opioids, it's after they had a surgery. If they had not had the surgery and been exposed to home oral opioids, it wouldn't have happened. But then there's about 60% of opioid misuse that comes from leftover pills. And that is like my friend's son, who it's a lot easier to still steal a pill and not have it be noticed than to steal a bottle of wine. So for kids who want to experiment, or anybody who goes to somebody else's party, you can go in the medicine cabinet and snag the 8 or 9 bottles that people have sitting around left over. So that's why the DEA does these take back days. And that's why the CDC says you can flush opioids down the toilet, because the risk is really, most of opioid misuse comes now from those pills. 20% of opioid use starts with street drugs, but there are people, about 15%, so it's like, okay, so why did those people who'd never had opioids before and then they had surgery, how come 6.5% end up having an opioid use disorder and the rest of them don't? So one thing that has not been very well dug into is this thing called rapid metabolism and euphoria. So when I asked the woman that I worked with later, because I hired her and she'd been through recovery, and I said, I do not understand how could you possibly get opioid use disorder, because I just feel stupid and sluggish. And she's like, dude, I feel awesome. It makes me feel lovable. It makes me feel like I'm a great person. It makes me feel comfortable in my own skin. And I don't feel that way usually. So how could I not want more of that? That's clearly a different genetic response and metabolism than what most people get. And so this euphoria is potentially related to rapid metabolizers. About 15% of the population will break down an oral pill so quickly that they get a rush. So it's not, there's one study in 2008 that found that people that were on opioids and had substance use disorder were 18 times more likely to have had that euphoria feeling, to remember the euphoria feeling, than those who were on chronic opioids but didn't have that euphoria memory and were stable and did not escalate and go into OUD. So hopefully we'll get some more research done on that. But
yeah, I remember the first time I spoke with my son's doctor, very prominent psychiatrist here in Atlanta, and very prominent. And he said to me, how difficult this is going to be, because if you think about happiness on a scale of 1 to 10, heroin's a 25. So you're unlikely to give it up.
Yeah, there is an interesting TED talk by a guy who talks about the people who came back from Vietnam after being heroin users and who stopped, and a lot of other people who were able to just stop. And some of the theories are that when you have a reward system from your social networks, from the people around you, from a lot of other things, then you're not as heavily influenced by this external rush. And so that certainly is likely to be part of it. That yes, now no question, once if you're wired to get a euphoria, a 25 happiness from heroin, then that's why 95% of people who have opioid use disorder need to go on medically assisted treatments, because you need to have something that is sitting on that receptor. Otherwise, you're going to crave constantly. It's so much more intense than alcoholism or wanting cigarettes or any of those sort of things. It's so much more intense, and that's why we need the medicines. But not everybody seems to have that same response.
Okay, so let's talk a little more about Duratherm, which is your new product designed for the lower back. I can tell the listeners it works. I promise you it does. And in fact, I'm going to go use it as soon as we finish this podcast. Um, but so the frequencies for that, are they the same that you originally developed for Buzzy and Vitacool? Are they different?
Yeah. Well,
Tell me how that.
let's describe this to your listeners. So when I decided to figure out what what was going on and how to help the opioid crisis, I decided what's the big, so I looked up what's the biggest bang for my buck, where are the biggest number of people who become dependent on opioids coming from, and it's low back pain. And what's the biggest incidence in the country? It's low back pain. So all right, I'm going to aim for low back pain. And so in addition to wanting to directly do something that decreases pain, you also need to work on all those other contextual areas of the brain. So you need to empower people. You need to have something where people can alter it. They can change it to work right, to work, personalized for them. And heat and cold are equally effective, but different people are very particular about what works for them. And sometimes it'll change. And sometimes for the low back, there's a place where you need acupressure. That also works. So I just took any study that had positive efficacy for the low back and I threw them all together. And then I had an overlay of these frequencies. And what I realized was at the time, what I was thinking was, you've got your people who've got Swiss cheese for vertebrae. They've had lots of surgeries. You've got people who have the dorsal nerve roots. You've got the nerve part, the discs are squishing them. And then you've got the people who've got the chronically spasm muscles, or they've got an overused muscle, or they've got to pulled something. So I wanted to be able to hit all those different areas differently. So I positioned the motors so that based on the frequency you spin them at, they will interact and they will have different locations of impulse to decrease that pain. Turns out one of the other big things that I think is going on is that anybody who gets pain in their low back, the fascia overlying, so the part that wraps around the muscles, that is called the fascia. It's like, a little saran wrap baggie that covers it. And there seem to be nerves for pain that haven't been well described that are stuck between that saran wrap and those muscles. And so if you use the right frequency of vibration, then you can actually loosen that up. And then all of a sudden, once that's not tight anymore, then the pain goes away and it doesn't seem to matter what the source was. So I should have had an NDA with all of your listeners, but the frequencies are ones that range, they're anchored with the one that works for Buzzy, which is 200 hertz, because the Pacinian corpuscle does 180 to 250. And that's what worked and that's what worked. So we started with that one, but then we ended up pivoting in some of our early trials around some different frequencies. And it turns out duration also matters. So there is a sort of catch point at which after that much time, the pain relief lasts much longer. So 20 minutes, it lasts about 4 hours, but people who use it for 40 minutes can get relief for a couple of days. And I don't exactly know why yet. How about you? When you use it, like
I
how
will
long do
tell you
use it?
that 40 minutes I'll usually go 40 minutes,
Yeah.
turn it on twice. And when I first got it, it worked. It was really in the throes of real serious pain, and I got much better very quickly, to the point where I didn't use it every day, and then I didn't use it for weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But back pain is different than other kinds of pain in that you really have two options. You can live with it and realize that it's going to be chronic and it's going to happen on and off, or you can have surgery. And in my case, the surgery would have been pretty major. 3 weeks in the hospital, nuts and bolts, and all that sort of thing. And worse, the likelihood that in 5 years, the vertebrae above or below would need the same surgery.
Mm.
That's what kept me from surgery. I'm old, but I'm only 66. So I could be looking at, another 4 surgeries or something. And then I guess I'd stand up a lot straighter, but
Well, and as you know, I mean, well, cervical, the neck surgeries tend to work really well. They've got a very high level of success. The low back surgeries don't. And there's a lot of what's going on with pain that is something called connectomes in your brain. It's also called hypersensitization. It's when your brain actually changes shape in response to chronic pain. And for example, the thalamus, you can see the change in pain of somebody who needs a knee replacement. And then 6 months after the knee replacement, the thalamus has gone back to normal. So with chronic low back pain, one of the reasons surgeries often don't work, and particularly these implanted stimulators with it being as good as placebo, not that placebo isn't, about 30% effective, but a lot of it's because your brain is still expecting pain and still has a meaning for pain and a context for pain and oh my, I'm not going to be able to go play with my 10-year-old. And all of those things together without having hope or an option, that's a problem. And so pain really is a process. Pain is use magnesium, drink extra water, because the being even slightly dehydrated increases pain, perhaps because the fascia gets shrink wrapped around the muscles and the signals get louder. It's really complicated, but now that we have functional MRI, I think we're going to unpack a lot of this in the next decade. Certainly, we've had a lot of people, we've had you and we've had 3 others who I know of so far, because we're still in our phase 2 trial, but they were either thinking about or going to have surgery and didn't, or were able to decrease their gabapentin levels. And I think that it's not one thing. It's always going to be a combination of things.
So what's kind of the go-to-market plan here? It's not an inexpensive product.
The $42 million question.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But it requires education, I think.
Yeah.
Either of a physician or the consumer. It's not something you're going to buy at CVS, I don't think.
No, definitely not. I mean, there's no way to get the cost of goods less than 3 figures any place in the near. And it really almost, it's hard to imagine getting the cost of goods less than 3 figures. That said, the real decision on it was that once I realized that Medicaid and Medicare don't pay for what they call comfort items. So we had VibraCool, which was, basically Buzzy, but with an ice pack and a compression wrap. And now we've got one with a heat pack. And the vibration. So it's got the 200 hertz frequency. You can stick it on 20 minutes or after a workout. And it was decreasing opioid use after surgery, just like it did for my friend. So we got a paper that showed it, a pilot of 14 patients, and Medicaid and Medicare would not pay for it because they said, we don't pay for comfort items. That's a massager. And I was like, yes, no, it's not. It's a mechanical stimulator. Here's what it's doing. It's 3 times more effective than TENS. You pay for TENS. Right. But this is actually more effective because of, frequency and all, all the stuff. And they're like, nope, FDA says it's a therapeutic massager. So I went to the FDA. They said, oh, okay, we'll categorize it as a therapeutic vibrator. Went to CMS, said, hey, it's a therapeutic vibrator now. They're like, yeah, it's still a comfort item. We're still not paying for it. So the only way that I can see to get these devices in the hands of people inexpensively is to get everybody to know about them. And the only way to do that, short of doing a million podcasts, is that doctors need to be prescribing them. And that means that Medicaid needs to pay for them. So the price of a post-operative L-spine brace that is reimbursed by Medicaid is $1,600. So right now, we have, we've gone through the SGS testing to sell it as a wellness device. So right now we have them, and the main, what we're doing is we're waiting with our NIH grant or NIH study to get the data that it reduces opioid use in surgery, and then we will go for a de novo with the NIH, or with a combined parallel FDA and CMS process that hasn't been used for 5 years, but that's the goal. Is we will go for a de novo indication for opioid use for low back pain, and then we will price it at whatever CMS decides, but the indication will be to prevent opioid use disorder, which costs about $78,000 to treat, or to prevent spinal cord implantable spinal cord surgeries, and those are $60,000 to $80,000. So what the price CMS determines will be predicated on the intention, and the people who are getting that prescribed are in these situations where it's really preventing all of that being done. Now, so that's why the current price, and we're waiting for the next batch. We're right now about 2/3 of the way through our phase 2 trial. So we're waiting for the next batch of them. So right now we actually only have a few of them, and that's part of why the price is what it is. But also, we don't want to cannibalize these if we went with that higher price point. So really, it's more of a therapeutic use kind of situation. It's also, I'm starting a new company with it because the channels and the market channels for a direct to physician or a reimbursed device, completely different market channel than an OTC. So we're moving into a new company. We'll be presenting it at AdvaMed in October. The NIH has 36 of their new medical devices that will be showcased at AdvaMed. So that's really where we're going to be launching it. But it's going to be going directly to the 4.3 billion total addressable market, which is the 500,000 lumbar spine surgeries a year, the 1 million workers' comp people who need to get back on the job and have low back injuries, the 800,000 who are doing RF ablation, and the failed epidurals, and the people who try it and 30% of them don't work. So there's 12 million epidurals a year. So those 4 million people who have a failed epidural and they're still in extreme pain, then prescribing them one rather than putting them on opioids.
Interesting. So is the phase 2, is that a pivotal trial that will allow you to go after this de novo designation, or it is?
Yeah, no, we spoke to the FDA before we started. They made comments on our trial design. We doubled the number of chronic patients. We doubled the follow-up. We added an active intervention rather than having a sham. And so all the things. So yes, it is the pivotal trial. The phase 1 trial we already published, and that one it reduced 57% for acute or chronic. It didn't matter for patients. And then, but for patients with either acute or chronic. What was interesting was the pain reduction was the same. Acute pain was higher than chronic pain, but the slope of the reduction was exactly the same. The acute patients favored ice, the chronic patients favored heat. Doesn't surprise me, but we published that. So that's what we're anticipating seeing when the study is done at the end of the year.
And how many participants are in that?
There were 20 in the phase 1. There are 160 in the phase 2.
How'd you select them?
The patients? So they are patients who come to a physical therapy or chiropractor office with acute or chronic low back pain.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because our outcome measure was my daughter's calling. The outcome measure was whether or not they reduced opioid use or whether they failed to initiate. So the acute patients, our primary outcome is you can't be on opioids, and do you start them? And for the chronic patients, it was, do you reduce the amount? Well, so the interesting thing is every study that's out there looking at opioid use as an outcome, it is in very finite controlled situations where it's like, we're using 6 Percocet, or we're giving you 20 Percocet. Let's see what happens. And what I wanted to do was see, knowing that 60% of people are getting these from their medicine cabinet, I wanted to know any source, anybody, because I know the risk is some people can just take one. So what opioids are there? So I had to make a Qualtrics data survey that in 4 questions could narrow down an opioid in your opioid diary to any opioid that's been put out there in the last 10 years. So where we are now is we actually have another SBIR that we're waiting to get the notice of award for to validate that data collection instrument, so that there's something called the medical device toolkit that the FDA has. And so that toolkit is approved studies and approved instruments to be able to definitively say, yes, this is superior to opioid use.
Let's just go back for a second and talk more about the SBIR and how you presented yourself for it, qualified for it, all the hoops you had to jump through for it, that sort of thing. We have a lot of founders that are listeners. Money is not freely available anymore. And so it might be of interest to the audience.
Yeah. So first of all, I highly recommend the NIH Seed Fund and Small Business Association have road shows all over the country at various different times of the year. And they're really good and very excited about sharing what they're doing and how to do it and what the process is. I will admit it's very Byzantine in terms of all of the different places all over the web where you find the requirements. They are trying to streamline that, but right now it's still pretty complicated. So you need to register with login.gov, and you used to need a DUNS number. Now it's just a unique identifier. And so there's a bunch of paperwork and stuff that takes a couple months before you can actually do the submission. You need to be registered with the Small Business Association. You need to be 51% employed by the small business. You need to be located in the US. And then you need to have, there's 2 different kinds. There's a lot of different kinds, but the ones that most entrepreneurs go for are an R43 or R44. And you can look those up. And those are the fast tracks. Those are what I've always gotten, which is a phase 1 that's 6 months that pays up to $220,000. And if you get it, you have certain milestones that are built in, and immediately you go to phase 2, which is a 2-year to 3-year. And that one has, I think, up to $1 million, up to 1.5. And so those, that's the thing. You can also go for just a straight phase 1. And that is demonstrating proof of concept. And then you go to your bigger pivotal trial in phase 2. There is also a mechanism to go straight to phase 2. So if you've got your pivotal trial done someplace else, you could then go straight to phase 2. But the process and the real problem, I think, that's frustrating for entrepreneurs is once you put in your submission, which happens 3 times a year in April and August and December or January, I don't remember, they've changed around a little, but once you put that in, then for example, we put in the SBIR for validating the opioid dose tool, put it in November. They had the meeting to look at whether or not it was responsive to the grant and whether or not the trial that we suggested doing was appropriate. They had that meeting in May, and we were anticipating the earliest start date would be July 1st, but it's now not. We're still doing paperwork, and we probably won't have it as a notice of award until September 1st, assuming that we do get it. So right now we're in the final throes of paperwork, but it takes, it's a good 3/4 of a year to find out if you have funding or not, which is a long time in the life cycle of a startup.
Is that paperwork that you filed yourself? Did you hire a consulting team to do it?
I do my own stunts. There's certainly, well, the thing is, I'm a scientist, right? So I know how to write a grant, but also how to write a protocol. I know what you need to do to submit to the IRB. Some of the stuff I've learned, but most of that part is the stuff that I know. And I can tell anybody listening, I didn't know how to do this until I went to UT Southwestern and did an NIH program a K30 and got a certificate. And basically all you need to do is you got 4 parts that you need to present, which is, here is how humongous the problem is. Here are the current solutions. Here are the inadequacies of those solutions and things we think might, and reasons why we think there may be a better way. And then knowing all of that, here is the better way that we're going to test. And so you really set those dominoes up, and it's those 4 paragraphs and those 4 dominoes. And that structure is what people are used to seeing. So with the SBIR, you can either do the research yourself as a company, or you can do an STTR, which is a tech transfer, and have a university near you do that. And there are a lot of, like, Mayo Clinic has actually hired somebody to help their clinicians work with industry to be the researchers that industry wants. Because it's finicky, and it needs a little, as a physician, you're not trained to look at opportunities like that. And so it's a different thing. Did that answer enough of the question for you?
I think so. Not having filed one myself, but what I'm looking for is just kind of a general introduction. And I think you did.
Yeah. It's about 130-page grant. So yes, it's a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time. And at the end of the day, there's bio sketches of the 5 people, there's the budget justification, there's the 12-page commercialization plan, there's the research strategy, and there's just all of these parts. So it's
and then how much interference is there thereafter in terms of monitoring, or just, Amy, what are you doing? Is there?
Very little. The process of vetting the science is extremely rigorous. So I've had the good fortune to be asked to be on numerous scientific review groups. And that's where they've got people from every part of the grant, from manufacturing to basic science, to clinical science, to clinicians, to commercializers, everybody sitting around, and mostly it's academics. And so you're given a handful, 5 to 8 applications to read, and then you all go around, and there's probably 20 of you discussing whether or not the science is good, whether it's innovative, whether it's going to change the field, whether the environment is good, all of these things. And so the projects that get funded are ranked. And in general, I've been really, really so pleased with how the NIH's vetting is. They're just
really,
yeah, everybody's working for, we don't get paid for this, or you get, some $200 honorarium, and you're spending, you're the top of your field, and you're spending a good 2-3 weeks.
Jury duty.
It's very much, it's nerd jury duty. But with homework. You can't just show up. You have to do all of this homework and write stuff up beforehand, and then write stuff up after. So once you do it, then once you are approved for it, you do have a program officer. You've got some milestones, and before you go from a phase 1 to a phase 2, you have to present what that you actually did, what you said you were going to do, that it seems like it's happening. So it is not without some checks and balances, but in general, most of the vetting is done up front, which is why last time I looked, it was something like 3% of fast tracks get approved and 25% of phase 1s.
Wow.
So yeah, so it's a fast track is not for somebody who doesn't know how to do science. If you're a company, I've certainly advised a few people on their grant work. And if you're a company, it needs to look like something that an academic is going to say, this person knows how to do research.
Okay. So beyond back pain, do you think that this can be, this technology can be used in other ways?
Oh yeah. In some ways, this is why I'm really excited to try to find a strategic partner, because we who work at my company, we have one guy and the rest of us are women, but we've used it for menstrual cramps. We've used it for kidney stones. We've used it for all sorts of things. I've tried to modify it for my shoulder. I know exactly how I would make the version of it that would be for the shoulder. I think that there's a lot of different ways that it can be used.
For dental work.
Oh, actually, no, we just got FDA 510K indicated for dental. So right
Really?
now, yeah, right. And there's 7 or 8. I think there's a new one this morning, actually. There's randomized controlled trials for dental because vibration passes beautifully through bone. So when you put it on your maxilla or your mandible, then if you're doing an upper palate shot, you put it on the cheek, and then the nerve, it blocks the feeling because it's vibrating all of the bones around where the shot's going. And
Really?
so that's, yeah, and it also is really good. So a lot of the vibration research on growth, on stimulating growth hormone, even on strokes. I mean, there's different frequencies that work for different things, but what we are indicated for is we just got dialysis, and we're actually, there's a Medicare and Medicaid program called TPNIES, which is for translational innovation for end-stage renal disease. And we're in the final phases of the comment, the public comment section, which is done August 25th. So between now and next Friday, we're hoping that a lot of the dialysis groups or patients on dialysis will write in that, yeah, the solutions for cannulation and needle pain now aren't adequate and they're not accessible, and having a Buzzy Pro for anybody who's on dialysis would be really helpful. And it's like $150 and they can reuse it in the clinic for years and years and years and years. So hopefully it'll get covered. Well, and as a mother of people who are in wisdom tooth removal age, knowing that 6.4% had OUD after getting opioids for wisdom tooth removal, I can tell you that none of my kids are going to get oral opioids afterwards. Sure, during surgery, fine, but not the orals afterwards. And we just got Vibracool just got the indication for treating the muscle pain after surgery. And so that kind of those uses, it's just having something that can be helpful. So yeah, so we've got people in our company who've also used it for after abdominal surgery, used it after wisdom teeth removal. It's not, nothing is an end all be all. It's really that we need to reconfigure how we approach pain and not look for a single silver bullet solution. But that said, the right frequency of vibration and cold or heat is a really good solution for a lot of different kinds of musculoskeletal pain.
Well, that's great news, Amy. I will tell you that in my own situation last year when it was really bad, the back pain, tramadol didn't work. I took it for 2 days and just stopped because it wasn't working. So why bother? But Durtherm worked, and it worked quickly. It was really pretty amazing. So I want to thank you personally for that, and also I want to let our listeners know. And
so I did a TED Talk in April on the main stage about our new understanding of the neuroscience of pain and why opioids are the wrong choice. And it will be coming out September 5th, and I will be fielding all of the people who are like, don't take my opioids away, and how dare you, we're not giving anybody opioids in the hospital. Because all I really want people to know is that there's a risk with surgeries. There are other alternatives. Pain-free is not the goal. And you can reframe pain to be more comfortable with lots of different options and throw away the pills in your medicine cabinet.
Great. That's just great news, Amy, from a personal standpoint as well as a scientific one. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I look forward to following up with you sometime in a few months and learning more about how Duratherm is going and how your marketing is happening. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for tuning in to the Life Sciences